Tonight, I wanted to talk to the title of my talk is From Lockdown with Love. Um, Thinking that, here we are. This is week 4 of lockdown. And here we are with a few billion other people all sheltering in place. And I'm calling it lockdown tonight. And a friend of mine who has worked in prison has told me, that's not really a good term, that the situation in prison under lockdown is so vastly much harsher than what we're experiencing. But I still think I'm going to use it. And I think some of us, as we were just talking in our breakout room, are experiencing some really harsh, not necessarily us, but we know of others who are really experiencing harsh conditions. So lockdown, I think, is a good word. I've heard this situation, a crisis, described in the press as a pressure cooker, and I think we can relate. I think by now most of us have read maybe dozens of articles or listened to a lot of teaching about coping under these conditions. And there are lots and lots that we have found, a lot of free videos and talks and other methods of helping us cope and support. And I think that it's really wonderful. It is a support. And at the same time, can be a little bit confusing. We've got like another profusion of things to make decisions about. We can't do it all. So I think there can be a little bit of confusion with that. And I thought, well, tonight what I would like to do is just discuss one strategy for coping under lockdown. And I'm going to be discussing it from 2 different perspectives. The strategy is one that many of you know, at least on one of the perspectives, and that's the strategy of Reins. It's one, I think it's a coherent practice that involves joining many different practices. We've taught it at IMCC, and certainly we teach it at UVA in MBSR, Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction class, and it's elsewhere. Maybe some of you have read about it. I know Tara Brach is out with a new book about rain. She calls it Rain. And I'm going to talk about that now, and I call it Reins with an S on the end. And as I said, 2 perspectives. One is the conventional perspective that many of you may have heard and some of you may not. But even for those of us who are familiar with rain, even for those of us who are familiar, it is a powerful approach. It's something that we can always, it doesn't grow old. We can always use it. So I'm going to be presenting it again tonight from that conventional perspective. I also want to talk about Reins from another perspective. And I'm calling that a freedom perspective. And that's not one, the other has been written about and talked about. And as I said, some of you may know about it. And this freedom perspective, it's going to be you won't find it in books, let me put it that way. But singly and together, both perspective of Reins, I can think, can really powerfully support us at this time of such difficulty for almost everyone. And even for us who are privileged to be in less stressful circumstances, Reins can be a mighty support. So first, I would like to talk about Reins from the conventional perspective, and that is dealing with difficult emotions and cultivating compassion. Reins is an acronym, R-A-I-N-S, each letter standing for something else. We practice each of the elements in the acronym, and I'm going to go over which each one of the elements means. The R in Reins means recognizing that you're experiencing a difficult perspective, a difficult emotion. This is fear, or this is panic, or this is vulnerability or anxiety or whatever the emotion is, recognizing it, not trying to avoid it or bury it or deny it, and not barreling through the day, trying to pretend it isn't there or just part of the scenery. It takes absolutely no extra time to recognize when we are experiencing a difficult emotion. And it's going to walk from the living room to the kitchen, and we can recognize it. We also need to recognize or realize that not noticing that the difficult emotion is present, not noticing, takes a toll. It takes a toll on us, on our life. I think that the difficult emotion is like a child or a puppy that is pleading for loving recognition. And that's the R, just as simple as saying, yeah, I'm really afraid right now. I'm really anxious. There's anxiety there right now. I can feel it. Well, we'll go on with that. Just recognizing. That's the R. The A in Reins is allowing. Allowing the difficult emotion to be present as it is without judging it. It's kind of a receptive response to the difficult emotion. It's a pause. Instead of just being sucked into it, overwhelmed by it, we pause just for a moment. We notice it's present and not judge it. It's something that's easy to say right now. So glib, we can say it. We can accept it's there and not judge. But in fact, that's what we do. We do judge, I think. I think we judge the emotion, and I think we judge ourselves as well. Because on the one hand, nobody likes difficult emotions. I mean, nobody. We want to get rid of them. And I think it's our automatic assumption that allowing a difficult emotion means we've got to like it. That's not what allowing means. Allowing an emotion doesn't mean you have to like the emotion. It means you just recognize that it's present. You can't pretend. Any way of trying to like a difficult emotion is a pretense, and that's another difficult emotion you're setting up right there. No, you just recognize it's there without judging it. You know, I think as spiritual practitioners, we kind of assume we should not have many that we should be clearing them up. They should be not as difficult or diminishing in the frequency. Because after all, as spiritual practitioners, aren't we supposed to be peaceful and equanimous and calm and so forth? I think there is a deep-seated, unrecognized assumption that if we are coming up with fear, or panic or dread or tightness or something, that this is a practice failure. I think that's how we tend to assume or see it. I think as spiritual practitioners, we often want to meditate it away. Meditate away a difficult emotion. Have you ever tried that? Have that sense? I mean, I have sometimes. You know, I want to get rid of it. Oh, I had a good meditation, we'll tell ourselves, because I feel more equanimous now that the emotion is gone. You know, we don't have to do that way. It's about recognizing it, that a difficult emotion is a normal expression of our being human. It's part of human life. We can't just live, I think we all know intellectually, but really convincing ourselves, really truly convincing ourselves that in fact it's normal. That's a hard thing. That's a hard sell. So again, it's just about greeting the difficult emotion and reminding ourselves it's normal. Reminding ourselves that, okay, this is a normal part of my life. It belongs in my life like others do. You know, I would say in talking about life, in the largest sense, life doesn't care one way or another. Whether we resist and deny a difficult emotion or whether we allow it, life flows on untouched. And emotions will arise and come and go, whether we're allowing or resisting. But allowing it makes a huge difference to us, to you, when it arises. I think some of you have heard that little, saying, whatever you resist persists. Resisting difficult emotion doesn't make them go away. It makes nothing better. It's going to strengthen the neural networks along which they kind of run as thought impulses. It doesn't work to try to deny it. So we greet with an openness of difficult emotions and do our best just to receive it. So that's the A. Talked about R, recognizing it. A, allowing a difficult emotion when it arises. And then I is investigating the difficult emotion. And that means actively turning toward it, dropping the story around it. What happened that made it occur again, maybe not again, but what happened and what might happen in the future, the catastrophizing that our mind so easily goes into, to expand any difficult emotion into something enormous, potentially enormous. And a lot of people are facing that these days, are they not? In all kinds of circumstances. Investigating means staying with it in the moment and experiencing it, and just experiencing it in your body. Rather than trying to think about it and elaborate on it, experience it. What's it like in physical sensation? Where are you feeling that sensation in your body? As a lot of people say, lean into it, leaning into the emotion, experiencing it as a physical sensation. And if we can do that, even if we're not so good at touching and experiencing physical sensations in the body, the very act of looking for them gives us some distance, some space between the difficult emotion, so that we're not just automatically overwhelmed by it. We've got a little bit of space in there, even if we don't feel we're too great at touching into the physical sensation. Some of us are better than others at that. So that's RAI, recognizing, allowing, investigating, then N in RAIN. N in RAIN stands for non-identification. Now I'll say this is one that recently has been changed. I'm not going to go into a whole history of it. There's a whole evolution of how Reins has come about. N stands for, and initially stood for, non-identification. And I'm going to go with that one. That means when a difficult emotion comes up, noticing it and doing all the steps we've said, and then realize, you know what? I'm not the difficult emotion. So often when we are overwhelmed by an emotion, we identify it. This is me. We need to recognize, we can take a step back. I'm not defined by this. Trying to understand it as the emotion and not my emotion. Recognizing that all human beings experience difficult emotions. Not just you. The universe has not just targeted me because I have a difficult emotion that's weighing on my heart or in my belly or in my jaws or wherever it is. That's what happens. So it is simply taking a different perspective on it, stepping back a little bit, non-identification. And the S in Reins, and I have put an S in Reins. The S stands for self-compassion. In addition to recognizing, investigating, and allowing, and not identifying, all at the same time. It's not saying not identifying doesn't mean to reject it. It just means that's another perspective on it. We don't have to think, in addition to recognizing it and investigating it, we don't have to think that it is all of what we are. We are something else. And this whole process, self-compassion, being compassionate to ourselves when we experience a difficult emotion. Perhaps embracing yourself with some kind of endearment. Yes, here's this difficult, here's my anger. Here's my anger. Talking to yourself, it's okay. It's all right to be angry. You might even want to use an endearment. I really think it's so helpful to use some kind of endearment. Okay, and you might say, call yourself friend or sweetheart or buddy. It's all right that there's a difficult emotion here now. This is normal. This is natural. I'm not doing anything wrong because I'm experiencing it. Being compassionate. In other words, the S stands for self-compassion, creating a caring relationship with yourself, bringing compassion to the raw place of that emotion, softening around it. This is Reins, R-A-I-N-S. It's a tool that we can use. We experience it, we are invited to practice with it when we're experiencing difficult emotion, but sometimes that's not exactly timely. We might experience it just a little, practice with it a little bit later. In any case, we can go through each of those steps, the R-A-I-N-S, and work with it, bringing these kind, wise approaches to ourselves in our difficult emotion. It's a tool, I call it, initially. But eventually, as you practice with it enough, it becomes automatic. You can automatically do this. You don't have to think R is recognizing, etc., and go down it step by step. It becomes a way of being. It doesn't have to be an intentional thought. The way of being is a way of being more compassionate, wiser, and less conflicted, or less strongly conflicted at any rate. That's Reins from the conventional perspective. And if this is new to you, and if you are interested and feel that you're not going to remember all of those steps, I will say that once this talk is posted to YouTube, and it will be, and you'll find out on our website, then there's going to be a summary of the Reins steps, the acronym, and what each step means. And if you want to use that, consult it and download it, you'll be free to do that. So not just throwing a bunch of terms and an acronym at you, but inviting you, consider it, use it. It is powerful. I said I was going to be talking about Reins from 2 points of view, however. This is the conventional one that we've just discussed. And even if you aren't familiar with the practice per se, you will be familiar with the perspective from which I discussed it. It's our ordinary, everyday perspective. You see, there's a me here and a me who feels hurt, vulnerable, angry, difficult emotions that sometimes we all know what that means. Bringing these wholesome steps to it, to enable us to adopt a softer way of being. But there's also another perspective that I want to talk about now, and that is what I'm going to call Reins in a freedom perspective. So before I do that, let me say, I think that, to talk about a conventional perspective is so ordinary, the perspective, that we have a hard time recognizing that it's even a perspective. It's rather like a fish in water, I think. And a fish is in water, they don't know about air. Our everyday life is the life we are in. Of course we think of it. We don't think of it as a perspective. It just is what is. There is another perspective to discuss, however. I'll say that when a fish is taken out of water, we all know what happens, the fish will die. But when we move out, even for a few minutes, out of the conventional perspective, in fact, there's joy. There is a freedom there. So this second perspective, the freedom perspective, it's what the Buddha was talking about when he spoke about liberation. Now, fact check here. The Buddha never used the term freedom perspective, and he never used the term reins either, by the way. But they're totally consistent with what the Buddha was pointing to. So I'm inviting you, if this sounds a bit weird, this freedom perspective stuff, just to let the words flow, just to listen. Don't try to analyze them. See if you can listen with your heart, if they kind of resonates there somewhere. So this acronym, Reins, from the freedom perspective, are recognizing that being in the pressure cooker of lockdown can be a teaching and a blessing. Being in the pressure cooker of lockdown can be a teaching as well as a blessing. Now, blessing isn't going to be the first word that springs to our minds when we think about lockdown. It's kind of strange, in fact. But lockdown, we all know, by its nature, stirs up difficult emotions. And in addition to using reins in the way I've just discussed in the conventional perspective, we can recognize that the suffering that we go through is a teaching. It's a teaching. Because we are in intense times, new openings can occur. Things that we identify as familiar fixtures in our lives are in many cases no longer present. Or if they are, they're not present in the same way. And our usual routines and pastimes, we all know, they're no longer present as they used to be. Our relationships with others in our household are thrown into new territory because they're so very, very, very present. We're spending more time. What about parents trying to homeschool children? It's a whole new ballgame, a new way of life for so many people. Not for everybody. Some of us have less adjustment, but for many of us. And for many of us, it can be kind of like, as they say in AA, kind of hitting bottom. We can get so stressed by these new circumstances that there are new openings. You know, familiar routines, when we are happy to have them, impart a sense of stability to life, right? We kind of know what's coming on next. And societies count on familiar routines in order to flourish in times of peace, which is why I thought, when I was thinking about this, about that Chinese saying, the Chinese curse, which I'm sure all of you have heard, may you live in interesting times. It's a curse. It's a curse because interesting times means everything's going to be disrupted as they are now. But in fact, when we think about it, what are uninteresting times? Times that are bolstered by the familiar, times that you can more or less count on, times that kind of can put you to sleep. They can easily allow us to live on automatic. I'm thinking like a happy dog or a contented cat sleeping in the sun. And we might rejoice for the happy dog and contented cat that are soaking up all the sunlight. But not much is happening there in terms of awareness, is there? And that's kind of like what can happen to us in the human dimension in times that are uninteresting. And on the other hand, at times of global crisis, pandemic, as they say, these are the times that try men's and women's souls. They make us sit up and they make us pay attention. And so we can become aware of our habitual behaviors, things that we'd always counted on and had unconsciously lived with, circumstances that had been just kind of on automatic are now highlighted. And questions arise like, who am I? Beyond all the familiar circumstances that I've counted on, who am I? What do I really want? What's my highest aspiration? You know, that we're so profoundly jolted. These times that are so stressful can cause us to really inquire, not idle inquiry and not just intellectual pondering something, but with a cry from the heart, with real urgency of really, who is this? Who am I truly? Such an inquiry, ideally, at some point or another, is put into a being by our spiritual practice. It stimulates that, spiritual practice does. But I think lockdown can stimulate this process. It's like on steroids, really making it go intensely. And I will say, I have talked to some people who in fact are experiencing just this intense openings in new ways to those questions. Well, who am I now? Who am I truly? So this is why I say that lockdown can be a blessing in this context. So that is the R of Reins from the freedom perspective. Of Reins from the freedom perspective, allowing yourself to listen to the heart's yearning and being pulled by that love. Let me back up a second. Of course, we all know that the ultimate, what can we say, goal, the goalless goal, whatever you want to call it, in Buddhism, is freedom, is liberation. It's awakening and embodying this awakened mind and heart in daily life. And keeping that goal in mind really clarifies life for us in many, many ways. We're less likely to be caught up in a dead-end kind of byway that doesn't lead to peace eventually down the line somewhere. Keeping it in mind. Now, what the Buddha did, his general approach, his teaching approach, a fundamental teaching that is suffering is the main motivator that causes us to seek freedom. Many of you have heard and know very well the first three noble truths. First noble truth is suffering in life. Second noble truth, cause of suffering is attaching. And third noble truth, when attaching is, I'll use the word let go, but it's not a great word here. When such attachment is let go of, there's a lessening of suffering. Now, in fact, we don't let go of attachment. I mean, that you can't just say, okay, I'll let go of my attachment. But what can happen is that we become aware of the degree to which we're attaching, not in blame, but just an awareness. The light of awareness enables a broader space, a more spacious space, I guess you would say, from which to hold attachment. Doesn't mean the attachment simply evaporates in thin air, or that we've used a whip and said, I'm letting go of that. It's not our determination. So that the first three noble truths of the Buddha. And the bottom line here I'd like to point out is that desire to relieve ourselves of suffering is the main incentive for practice in this context. And we can note that this means that practice from this perspective is rooted in aversion, our aversion to suffering. We want to break free from it. And that's natural. Of course, as human beings, we don't want to suffer. Of course, it's an aversion to suffering that we want to let go of. Nothing wrong with it. And I think we can say, therefore, that our desire to relieve suffering kind of pushes us into freedom. I think this is what the Buddha's teaching, he never said it that way, but this is in effect of what the direction of the Buddha's teaching is. The push of aversion to suffering, however, is, I suggest, only half of the story. We are pushed into practice by our aversion to suffering. It's half of the story. The other half of the story is that we are pulled into practice by love. We're pulled by the love of this is the heart's yearning. The heart yearns for freedom. It is, and I think you've all at some point or another felt it as you go in. You have felt the yearning heart and this love that can't really be spoken for what is there. A great love, the heart's yearning. and that pulls us. Once we're in touch with it, once we listen to it, I think that we're drawn like a magnet to practice. We turn like a flower to the sun, the yearning of the heart. Both of these together, the push of getting rid of aversion to suffering and the pull of love, brings us to practice. And it's possible, I think, that love may be more powerful in suffering in that it enables us more readily to stay with the hard questions like, who am I really? Who am I really? If we're a lover of truth, if we really want to know, that love can carry us through, can cause us to stay, to stick. So this, I suggest, is allowing reins in the freedom perspective, recognizing the blessing and allowing ourselves to look past what's familiar and to feel the heart's longing. Third, investigating, exploring what your heart is telling you, responding to the heart's call, investigating the new territory that it's pointing to, where it's drawing you to. You know, the teacher Ram Dass, who died very recently, put it really succinctly when he said, life is a school and we're here to get an education. Take the course. We're born, sent here, we're born. We're here on this planet to evolve, to move toward fulfilling our human potential, to become more aware and more loving beings. So taking the course, it means experiencing directly the heart's longing, that longing that is always there, always has been and will be. So R-A-I, investigating and responding to the heart's call. And then N, in the conventional perspective, it's called non-identification. It's recognizing that in the conventional perspective, that we're not just, our emotions just aren't personal. There's something more than that. From the freedom perspective, the N in Reins can be understood in its full meaning. Non-identification, our natural state. Our natural state, which is unbounded awareness. That awareness, that emotions and all other expressions of life, including ourselves and everything that we are, all of these are expressions of the natural state. And, you know, the Buddha referred to it with many, many different terms. And we know many of them: unborn, unfabricated, the unformed. And he talked about the true man, and we can say true woman also. There's one of his suttas about the true man or true woman, or we could call it true home or cosmic consciousness. We can also call this natural state love. Love in this universal sense. Whatever it's called, whatever your choice, it's what you truly are. N, natural state. The 13th century Zen master Dogen, he said in a quite famous quote, now quite famous, he said, to study Buddhism is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to love all things, are also translated. To forget the self is to be intimate with all things. So the truth is, you don't need to meditate for 10 years or attend dozens of retreats. Those are all good and important, and we do them. But to know the natural state, to directly experience it, you need listen to the heart's yearning and go where it pulls you. maybe for a few moments, but it pulls you there. And finally, S, in Reins in this freedom perspective. Again, it's the S of self-compassion. I spoke about it earlier in the conventional context, bringing compassion to our emotions and ourselves. From the freedom point of view, S is an expression of unbounded love. It doesn't pick and choose, as one Zen master said. It's intimate with all things. It's the love that shines naturally through you, because it's naturally who you are. It's not yours, but you're its. That love is not yours, but you are its. You are an expression of it. So here, I would like to say, if we think about self-compassion from the freedom perspective, that word self would be capitalized. Capitalized as a self. It's not the small individual self, but the capital universal self. And on this last component of Reins, the self-compassion, this in fact is where the two perspectives meet, the individual, the conventional, and the freedom perspective. They intertwine because as we live in this world, both as individual human beings and as expressions of this, what to say, natural state, both are there. Both are around us everywhere, even in the midst of suffering under lockdown. And this is especially at a time when we're invited, as some people are finding, time when we can really see that and notice. Together, they're the embodiment of daily life. So thank you for listening.